Have you ever heard an excuse so ridiculous that instead of helping someone win a case, it actually destroyed their entire argument? Because that's exactly what happened the day a 19-year-old young woman walked into my courtroom and tried to convince me that she shouldn't have to pay rent for an apartment she personally agreed to rent, an apartment she personally lived in, and an apartment she enjoyed every single day. Now, after spending decades on the bench, I've learned something very important. The first versions of a story is almost never the whole story. So when this case landed in front of me, I assumed there had to be more to it. Maybe someone had broken an agreement. Maybe someone wasn't telling the full truth. Maybe there was a missing piece that would change everything. But what I didn't know was that over the next few minutes, I was about to hear one of the most unbelievable excuses I'd heard in a very long time. And the strangest part, she seemed convinced that her explanation was helping her case. It wasn't, not even close. In fact, with every sentence she spoke, she was digging herself deeper and deeper into trouble. And by the time it was over, even she seemed surprised by how badly things had gone. But before we get into this unbelievable case, if you enjoy courtroom drama, justice being served, and stories where people get trapped by their own words, make sure to subscribe and leave a like on the video. Trust me, the deeper this story goes, the crazier it gets. Now, let's begin. When this case first came before me, it looked incredibly simple. A roommate dispute, nothing unusual. Over the years, I've handled thousands of cases involving unpaid bills, damaged property, broken agreements, and financial disputes. Most of the time, the truth becomes obvious within minutes. I assumed this case would be no different. I was wrong. The plaintiff was 19-year-old Nathaniel Turner. The defendant was 19-year-old Elizabeth Hovey. The two of them had signed a lease together for a 2-bedroom apartment. Simple, straightforward, no mystery, or at least, that's what it looked like. Then I started asking questions. And that's when things became interesting. Nathaniel explained that both of them signed the lease. Both of them agreed to share the expenses. Both of them agreed to pay their fair share of the rent. Everything sounded perfectly normal. Then one small detail caught my attention. At first, it didn't seem important, but it eventually became one of the most revealing parts of the entire case. Elizabeth didn't move into the apartment alone. She moved in with her boyfriend. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing unusual about that. People date, people move in together. That's life. But what immediately stood out to me was this. The boyfriend wasn't on the lease. He wasn't legally responsible for the apartment. He wasn't legally responsible for the rent. Yet, somehow, he was living there, enjoying the apartment, sharing the space, receiving all the benefits, without any legal responsibility. And after all my years on the bench, I've learned something. Whenever an extra person quietly appears in a financial dispute, pay attention, because they're often connected to the real story. At that moment, I wasn't sure how important the boyfriend would become, but I made a mental note of it, and then I kept digging. Nathaniel explained that he moved into the apartment first. A few days later, Elizabeth moved in. At the beginning, everything seemed fine. No major problems, no major conflicts. Then the rent stopped coming. September arrived, no payment. Weeks passed, still no payment. October arrived, nothing. Now, if you've ever lived with roommates, you already know where this story is heading. Few things destroy living arrangements faster than money problems, especially when one person keeps paying and the other person keeps making excuses. As I listened to Nathaniel, I could hear the frustration in his voice. And honestly, I understood why. Imagine being 19 years old, trying to build your first independent life, trying to manage bills, trying to stay financially afloat, and suddenly finding yourself paying expenses that were supposed to be shared. That's not just frustrating, that's stressful. At that age, it can feel overwhelming. But what really stood out to me was this: Nathaniel wasn't asking for anything outrageous. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't trying to profit from the situation. He simply wanted repayment for rent he claimed Elizabeth never paid. That's it, a simple claim. And usually, simple claims have simple answers. Usually, so I asked him a question that completely changed the direction of the hearing. When did Elizabeth move out? Nathaniel gave me the date, mid-October. Interesting, very interesting, because that meant she wasn't there for a weekend. She wasn't there for a few days. She lived there long enough to understand exactly what was going on, long enough to understand the arrangement, long enough to understand the responsibilities, long enough to understand that rent isn't optional. At least, that's what I assumed. But I still hadn't heard her side of the story. And after decades in the courtroom, I've learned never to rush to conclusions. Sometimes the person who looks wrong at first turns out to be right. Sometimes the entire story flips upside down. So I turned toward Elizabeth, and that's when the case took a turn I never expected. At first, she seemed confident, not nervous, not worried, confident. And whenever I see that kind of confidence in my courtroom, I pay close attention. Because confidence usually means one of two things. Either someone knows they're right, or they have absolutely no idea how wrong they are. I was about to find out which one this was, so I asked her a very simple question. A question that should have had a straightforward answer. Why didn't you pay the rent? For a moment, I expected to hear something important. Maybe a financial emergency, maybe a broken agreement, maybe some shocking detail Nathaniel had left out. Instead, I heard an answer that immediately made me stop and think. Elizabeth said she wasn't prepared. That's it. She wasn't prepared. I remember sitting there wondering if I had missed something. Maybe there was more. Maybe she wasn't finished. Maybe the real explanation was still coming. So I listened. And the more I listened, the stranger it became. Nathaniel moved in earlier than expected. Payments were made before she was ready. Everything happened too quickly. And as she continued speaking, one question kept repeating in my mind. What does any of that have to do with paying rent? Seriously, what does that have to do with paying rent? Because when you sign a lease, you agree to pay rent. Not when you're comfortable, not when you're ready, not when someone reminds you. You pay rent because that's the agreement. It's that simple. But Elizabeth seemed convinced that her explanation solved the problem. It didn't. In fact, it created an even bigger one. The more she talked, the weaker her argument became. So I decided to go back even further. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden in what happened. Sometimes it's hidden in where the story began. I asked her where she had been living before moving into the apartment. She said she was living with her parents. Fair enough. Then I asked where the boyfriend had been living, his parents. And at that moment, everything became crystal clear. There was no housing emergency, no crisis, no desperate situation. No one was forcing them to move. What I was looking at were two young adults who wanted independence. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, but independence comes with a price tag, a very real one. You don't get an apartment without rent. You don't get privacy without expenses. And you don't get freedom without responsibility. Yet Elizabeth seemed genuinely shocked by that reality. Then she returned to the same excuse again. Nathaniel moved in first. Nathaniel paid first. Nathaniel didn't communicate properly. Nathaniel this, Nathaniel that. And honestly, at that point, I was running out of patience. Because even if every single thing she said was true, it still didn't explain the missing rent. Think about it. Let's assume Nathaniel moved in first. Let's assume his communication wasn't perfect. Let's assume he handled everything badly. Would that magically erase her rent obligation? Of course not a single dollar. And that's when I realized what the real problem was. Elizabeth wasn't answering my question. She was avoiding it. Every time I asked about responsibility, she talked about communication. Every time I asked about rent, she talked about timing. Every time I mentioned the lease, she shifted the focus back to Nathaniel. And after hearing thousands of cases, I've noticed a pattern. People with strong arguments confront the issue directly. People with weak arguments try to change the subject. At that point, I had heard enough. I looked directly at Elizabeth and asked a question so simple that the entire courtroom seemed to go quiet. You signed the lease? You lived in the apartment? Your boyfriend lived there too. So tell me something. Why exactly shouldn't you have to pay rent? And there it was silence. Then she returned to the same excuse, the same explanation, the same loop. And that's when I gave her a reality check. I looked directly at her and said, you wanted the apartment. You wanted the independence. You wanted to live with your boyfriend. You wanted the adult lifestyle. Fine. That was your choice. But why should Nathaniel pay for it? The courtroom became even quieter. Nathaniel understood exactly what I was saying. Everyone in the room understood exactly what I was saying. And deep down, Elizabeth understood too. Because there was no answer to that question. None. Then she said once again that she wasn't prepared. And honestly, I couldn't believe I was still hearing that argument. You don't sign a lease and then act surprised when rent is due. You don't move into an apartment and then act shocked that living there costs money. You don't enjoy the benefits and then refuse the responsibility. That's not how adulthood works. Over the years, I've learned something about people. Many people want freedom, but they don't want accountability. Many people want independence, but they don't want responsibility. Many people want adult privileges, but they don't want adult consequences. And sitting in front of me was someone learning that lesson in real time, because one rule never changes. Inconvenience and injustice are not the same thing. Life being inconvenient doesn't mean someone else owes your bills. Things not going according to plan doesn't make contracts disappear. And being unprepared doesn't stop rent from being due. By the time we reached the end of the hearing, the outcome wasn't a mystery anymore. I reviewed the lease, the payment history, the timeline, the facts. Everything pointed in the same direction. There was no confusion, no missing piece, no mystery. Just one simple truth. Nathaniel paid expenses that should have been shared. Elizabeth failed to meet her responsibility. So I ruled in Nathaniel's favor. Elizabeth owed him $775. Judgment for the plaintiff. Case closed. Months of frustration resolved in seconds. Nathaniel didn't look excited. He looked relieved, because for months he had been carrying a burden that wasn't entirely his. And finally, there was accountability. As for Elizabeth, the money would eventually be paid. The judgment would eventually be resolved. But the lesson? That would stay with her much longer. Life has a funny way of teaching people lessons, sometimes gently, sometimes painfully, and sometimes very publicly. This was one of those lessons. The truth is simple. Freedom and responsibility come together, always, no exceptions. You don't get the apartment without the rent. You don't get the lifestyle without the bills. You don't get the benefits without the obligations. And when you try to hand those obligations to someone else, eventually reality catches up. Looking back on this case, one thing stands out to me. The people who succeed in life aren't always the smartest. They aren't always the richest. And they aren't always the most talented. More often than not, they're simply the people who accept responsibility, the people who do what they agreed to do, the people who handle problems instead of creating excuses. Because excuses may feel good in the moment, but excuses don't pay rent, excuses don't pay bills, and excuses don't win cases. Now I want to hear from you. Was my ruling fair? Do you think Elizabeth deserved more understanding because she was only 19 years old? Or do you believe that once you sign a lease, age no longer matters and responsibility takes over? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy courtroom stories where excuses collide with facts, where accountability finally catches up, and where the truth always rises to the surface, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications. Because trust me, if you thought this case was unbelievable, the next one might be even crazier. And remember, signing your name takes only seconds. Living up to that signature, that's the real test. I'll see you in the next case.